Welcome to the Inspired Action Podcast. This is where we have motivational, inspiring conversations and interviews that we hope you'll enjoy listening to.
Join us and other inspired actioneers on this alchemical, transformational journey.
Welcome back to the Inspired Action Podcast. My name is Jay, and this is Pod 137, a very special edition. We have an interview for you today. And of course, we have our hostess with the mostest, Lita Herman. Come on down.
Welcome back, Inspired Actioneers.
I've been saying that a lot lately. I got to come up with a new line.
We're happy to share this interview with you today that we decided we wanted to bring to you because we've been so interested in fields of energy, especially fields of energy related to the heart.
Of course. And Lita, I love when we do interviews. You do them really well. And so we did this modern science. They're discovering more and more about the heart, that it's not just this pump. It has so much more. It emits a field of energy. And I really wanted, to bring this interview with Lita and Keith. We're going to talk about him a little bit because they just get into this jam about science and alchemy and all these great things. And to be able to, work in alchemical healing, you need to cultivate as practitioners of yourself the ability to access the void of your heart and to access this tremendous healing capacity, which I think is unlimited.
Yeah.
And that it's in each one of us, every one of us. There's no like you have it, I don't have it, I don't have it, you have it. Like everyone has it.
And this might seem a little woo-woo to some people. And, the science...
I think our listeners are ready.
I think
they're okay with woo-woo.
I was going to say that the science is kind of new. And there's research that different institutions have done. So it's exciting. And, sometimes the research gets debunked or criticized and other people are
ignored
excited
or
about
heard.
it. Yeah.
Sometimes it seeps through social media.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's out there.
And we're not here really to discuss the nuances of each of these theories, but really to talk about this Chinese medicine, Taoist alchemy, philosophy about the mind and the heart. And just really looking at what we call heart/mind. And it's the feeling that, our mind isn't really located in our brain, but in our hearts. And that's why we have feelings. We feel them in our hearts.
Yeah, I like that. And I think, we could talk about heartbreak, that physical pain in the chest, or even, heart disease, or how about a heart attack? Like all these different things that we feel in the heart.
Yeah.
But we also feel it in the mind.
Yeah, that's a good point. Whenever someone comes to me with heart disease of any type, my first question is, what's going on in your love life? Were you getting a divorce? Did you lose your loved one? Or was there a betrayal in your life, like at work or with a friend, or some kind of really aggressive legal problem, perhaps? There's so many variations, but often we'll see that. It's like these bring bitterness and sadness and negative emotions to the heart, which, in Chinese medicine, the heart is that center of those emotions and it feels all of that.
It's kind of hard to argue with that, Lita. Wow.
Yeah.
That's like a lot of things that's going on.
Yeah. So today isn't really about proving or disproving science. It's about opening our minds to new ways to look at the energy within us and around us. And so that's why we invited the podcast hosts of The Future of Wellness to come onto the podcast for a chat.
Yeah, I think it's a good time to nerd out, sit back, have a cup of coffee, let things just roll on. Some will stick, some will not. I thought it was a fascinating conversation.
Yes.
And I just am so happy that he came on the podcast with Lita.
Yes, and I'm nerd number one. So I love this stuff. And for me, I'm fascinated with fields and how they relate to healing, because even a thought form, to me, can influence your field of energy. Like, let's say your doctor gives you a blood test and you get the results and you feel awesome when you took the test. And then the test result comes back like bad news, like some markers off. And then you take it to heart, like beep, 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 heart. Yep. And, notice that word, heart. And you have emotions about that. And guess what? Suddenly you used to feel great. Now you're not feeling so good.
Ghost eyes again. They're trying to find something to convince you that maybe something's wrong. You need to stop it right at the beginning.
Yep. You start feeling symptoms that weren't there before. And the big question is, here's the big question. Did that blood test predict those symptoms, or is it actually causing them due to your anxiety in your heart about the blood test?
Yeah, so many people feel way worse after the testing of not just the blood, but many different things because they maybe necessarily didn't think it was that bad.
Yeah. And of course, knowing what's wrong can sometimes be a huge relief for anyone that doesn't feel well and can even give a person hope that there's a cure. So it's not that the tests are the issue at all. It's the thoughts we have about them. And those thoughts are powerful and they create fields of energy that then affect our health and even the people around us.
All right. Well, that's pretty cool. We're going to be talking here longer than the podcast. So let's get this podcast going. But before we stop, we just want to remind everyone that if you're listening to this in real time when we're releasing it, which is February 2025, we have a webinar in February 27th in the Alchemy Learning Center related to this topic of the field. So if it's your jam, come join us. We're going to talk more about it.
Yes.
And also, if you have a second to rate and review the podcast at any moment, if you've had any enjoyment, a chuckle, a smile, a thought, just give us a little shout out in Apple, Google, Spotify, wherever you listen to podcasts. It helps other people all over the world find this little podcast, and that makes us happy.
Yes. And the webinar is going to introduce you to your heart's energetic field, how to access it, what we call the void of the heart.
All right. So go get your heart on.
Yeah. I have today a very special guest, Keith Parker, who is a teacher, an author, and healing practitioner with expertise in the human energy field, contemplative science, and the healing arts. He is also the co-host of the Future of Wellness podcast. He also founded or co-founded the Field Dynamics Energy Healing Modality and the Energy Field Dynamics website back in 2018. And he's doing that to help individuals with their personal growth and as a platform to exemplify the potential of energy healing. And we had a great conversation on his podcast not that long ago. And we got so excited about all the things we were chatting about that we decided to do a conversation on the Inspired Action podcast about fields of energy and how they can potentially, help us in our lives, in our own healing work, in our healing work with our clients if we're practitioners. And so, Keith, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
I'm very glad to be here. Thanks so much for having me on.
Just super excited to have you as like a subject matter expert about fields and this whole work that you're doing called Field Dynamics. And I thought we'd start off as simple as we can and just have you kind of explain to us what are fields in general. And I know that there may be different kinds, and maybe you can explain that to us. That would be really helpful as a starting place, I think.
Yeah, that is a good place to start. Obviously, we're not talking about, looking out in your backyard and saying I have a nice field of grass or anything like that.
Yeah.
It's also not the difference between fields of science versus fields of, history, et cetera, studying those kinds of things. For the purposes of the conversation, it's important to be clear. We're talking about energy fields, and energy fields are a big thread into a lot of different philosophical things, as I think we'll discover in the conversation or touch into. But fundamentally, we're talking about domains of electromagnetism. And that's why they're very, very interesting. So we could think of a field as an energy field. We can think of it as an electromagnetic field. And we can also think of it as a field of information. And all of those three things are relevant. And immediately, if we touch into that idea of electromagnetism, we can start to have insight as to the nature of the behavior of them, why they're really interesting to consider when we realize that our bodies are material and these fields of energy and information are electromagnetic, immaterial. So it immediately pops us into that physical versus metaphysical, or visible versus generally invisible domains.
I like the idea of that. And it makes me think of the word qi in Chinese medicine. And how do you kind of like work that into what you just said? Is it the same? Do you think they're different?
Absolutely. I think that qi and prana and subtle energy is described in all the different medical and spiritual traditions of the world is talking about the electromagnetic interface to the physical body. And we have the adjacent bioelectricity of the body that science talks about now. And we understand that your nervous system or cellular voltage. All of these things are related to a living body. In a certain sense, if you don't have voltage or electricity in your body, you're dead, right?
Yeah.
In a basic sense, but cardiac arrest, right? But nonetheless, that is really the surface of the electromagnetic interface.
Yeah.
It's the very beginning. It's the level at which science can detect, and that a lot of people can become somewhat aware of quite quickly in subtle perception. But it gets more and more deep and complex and nuanced when you get into what is the total structure of the human energy field, and it takes us down the rabbit hole of the aura, takes us down the rabbit hole of dimensions, and like chi is not a single dimensional thing. It's a really complex thing, and it's a confounding thing because it means a lot of things at once.
I want to go down the rabbit hole with you. That sounds really exciting. We can nerd out on this together. But before we do that, one of the reasons I wanted to do this episode is not only to talk about the energy fields as sort of chi fields or whatever we want to call it, but more that you mentioned it just briefly, information or idea fields. And one of the things that we've talked about on the podcast before is that sometimes these fields of thought can affect us as, people that maybe have fallen ill. And now they have a field of thought, a field of ideas, a field of information. For example, like if someone has cancer or something like that, there's a very large field that's attached to those concepts. And I wanted to, before we get into more of these energy fields in the body or around the body, I wanted to know what you thought about that idea.
What I think about thoughts?
Yeah, thoughts as fields or ideas as fields. And what would you say around that idea?
Yeah, well, it is important for people listening who don't know me, and presumably most would not who are listening. I actually see the human energy field really clearly. And that happened as a kind of an accident or a byproduct of doing inner work, meditation and healing work for a long time. And I had a kind of classical kind of explosive kind of opening, let's say. And all of a sudden I could see my aura and other people's energy fields and energy fields of other things, other objects. And I also could see and feel all of the chakras. I could see and feel all of the meridians. I mean, all of a sudden I would put my fingers together and the circuit would go down, shoot down my arm and just create these different lines of energy around my body. And I was, awestruck and confused, but nonetheless, reckoning with the fact that these things were real when I didn't actually have that belief system before the direct experience. So my perspective on these things and orientation is coming from both an experiential place, which is somewhat rare or unique to have that ability. And then at the same time, I'm also have been voracious in studying the world's traditions, both ancient and modern, in trying to make sense of this very phenomena, which I have that verifiable access to my own experience, so I can kind of test and check and compare different systems and mappings, and try and make sense of it as a whole. Because most traditions are in kind of silos and they're separate and they have different language, and to create a kind of contemporary map, it takes, I think, a lot of work, a lot of time for anybody to attempt to do that. And so it's coming from those two different places. So as you asked about thoughts, when you think, every time you think, a structure is created in your field, in your energy field. And we could call it the human energy field. You could call it the biofield, but it's a little slippery. You could call it the aura, and that's like the traditional way of talking about it. And every thought has an accompanying object in your field. So a thought is actually a thing. And, this isn't an insight of mine. This is something I can verify because I literally can see it. But furthermore, it's something that's been talked about for a very, very long time. They're often called thought forms. Often it has that connotation. Sometimes the thought form means something else. But nonetheless, thoughts are things, thoughts are objects. but they're not material physical objects. They're electromagnetic, higher dimensional or multidimensional objects. And in that object is contained the information of the thought, like whether it be something really instructive, like I'm going to the store, or it be something more belief oriented, like I'm not good enough to do this, or it even be the underlying belief behind an emotion, which is, I'm not confident in my ability to do this, which then is connected to a certain kind of an emotion, let's say. So there's thoughts or things. It's a pretty big deal to consider that. And that actually it's alarming to start to get into the implications of us on a personal level, because it means actually that we have responsibility for our thoughts. And that can be really challenging because most thoughts happen without actual conscious intention. So it should make us really curious, if we take this message seriously, that we start to kind of get used to what's going on inside, to realize it's having an effect on us and even how it connects to other things, which is another area or field of inquiry.
Yes. Yeah. I have noticed over the years of working with people that are, extremely unwell, that that when they get attached to that illness and all of the sort of surrounding cultural belief systems around it, it's very hard for them to separate their own thoughts, their own unique thoughts from that. The deeper they get into it, I often say, like, if we can work on the illness at the very start of it before they get sort of hooked into that field of thought. But I guess from what you're saying, it's really their own field of thought just being influenced by the outer field of thought about it.
Yeah, well, you brought up there the idea of like how illness might present itself in relation to thinking, and how that also might gain traction and stickiness within a person's system.
Stickiness, that's a great word.
And really the deepest layer that kind of hooks things into us on some level is identifying with something. So when we identify as this is me, then we really hold on to it. And this is classically why meditation is so useful for so many of us, is because meditation in general is just when we start to be able to look at all of the phenomena of experience, which is pretty straightforward in a way, even though it's very cluttered in there when you get started. You really are just left with the sensations of your body and the thoughts in the mind. And you can actually see those things as objects. Like, you can see a thought. Most people don't realize that they can see and be aware of a thought, like, oh, I'm thinking this versus I am this thought. And when you are that thought, it's what Eastern traditions would, in a certain sense, say you're asleep, in that you're not aware of the thinking happening, and thereby you're identified with it. And when you're identified with it, you're very invested in it. You're pouring your energy, so to speak, in it. It's when we are able to kind of disidentify with our thoughts and essentially the mind, and we can disidentify with the sensations of the body in a healthy way, not in a running away kind of way, but in a healthy relationship, that we start to be able to see this whole matrix of our experience, which is that whole body, mind, spirit thing going on.
Yeah, we often quote Eckhart Tolle in The Power of Now, talking about becoming the watcher. And just that idea of like watching yourself have thoughts. It's very powerful to kind of separate yourself from that impact and effect of those thoughts. I like that idea a lot. So let's talk a little bit more about, let's get down the rabbit hole a little bit more about, you mentioned biofields, you mentioned auras, tell us a little bit more about, you kind of, gave us a very brief introduction of the fields in general. And so I'm thinking about like someone listening who's like, why would I need to know this? What's this about? Maybe they're not a healer. They're just interested in themselves. Why is this important information? How could they utilize this in their lives? So maybe like and I know science supports this. So anything that you feel like would be a good entry point into maybe some of the science behind this would be great.
Well, okay. So on some level, to really start to take this stuff in, which is why I love energy healing, which is why I'm so involved with energy healing, is because just to get into literally the shallow end of it at a factual level, let's say, means that you have to really challenge your presumptions about what reality is. And that's a lot to take in. It's one thing to do some kind of self-transformation, to do inner work and healing and everything, but it's a lot to kind of just have the openness or the willingness to tear down the house, and it's not easy to do that. And somebody doesn't need to do that. Like, you don't have to be interested in that, but to really open ourselves up to a re-envisioning of what we think's going on does require that for most of us. Certainly did for me. And it doesn't happen by snapping your fingers or having one single experience or listening to one talk. It's weeks and months and years of being open-minded and slowly going through an integrated change in oneself.
And I do think the audience has been hearing a lot about alchemy, which is the same philosophy. So I think they get that. So I think we can assume that that's going to be something they're interested in. So
yeah. I mean, look, so we have this material realm or this material space in which our bodies exist. And we know that that's true because we can see it, we can verify it, we can measure it, et cetera. And science is really focused there. But what's also happening is that we have this thing called mind, and we know we're having a body-mind experience. And if you look at it just from a basic sense, it's this duality where your mind is in one place in a sense, or your mind exists and your body exists. But, very rarely do we ask the question, like, what is my mind, or where is my mind? And, you could speak to a neuroscientist or a lot of people in mainstream science today, and they might say that your mind is your brain. And actually our culture has somehow been convinced of that being the case, but it's really, really far from being remotely verified in any way whatsoever. It's not scientific to say your mind is your brain at all, but a lot of people have just kind of jumped on that bandwagon because we don't really have a good answer, to be honest, at the moment at all.
And the Chinese call it heart mind because they much more prefer to think of it as the heart than the brain.
Yeah. Well, if we just look at that duality, then we might start to consider what is like a general framework for how things are existing. And fields are where we get a kind of an answer or an insight into this. And that is that you have a body, and your body is material, and you have a mind, and your mind is immaterial. And actually, your mind is the thing that you don't see, but it exists. And your body is the thing you do see, and it exists. So when we start to talk about fields and the human aura, what the human aura is, and it's always been classically described this way, one way or another, is that the aura is the structuring of all of the objects of mind, all of the things that we're saying. Thoughts are things, thoughts are objects. It's that your aura, your field, is the reflection or the projection of all the structures that are produced by mind. And in a sense, what we might start to consider is that there is this other side to everything we see as physical, as having kind of an electromagnetic architecture, if you will, like a field architecture on the other side of the coin. The yin and the yang. The body is the yang in this case, and the mind is the yin. It exists, but it's subtler and you don't see it. And it's made of something different than the body, but they're connected. They're talking, they're communicating. They're not fundamentally separate, but they do exist in different domains, but they're kind of complementing one another. How is it, for instance, that distance healing works? Right. People get into like, how is it that I can be in one place and another person can be in a different place, and we get online or something like that, and we do a healing session. There's all these things that take place that are just happening energetically. It's because it's not bound by physical space. It's not bound by a material restriction of space, but it's actually this other aspect of what's going on, which is what's mental. It's what's electromagnetic. And you could even get really dangerously language specific and go into the language of time and actually talk about how your body's in space and your mind is in time. That's also another way of talking about it that's more complex for us to digest usually, to consider that thing. But the duality idea, all of these dualities that we talk about, and this is the way I talk about it, is that when we talk about electromagnetism, time, space, mind, body, that they're actually yin yang. They're actually all reflections of the same design feature of reality at all these different levels. And the mind is the electromagnetic, auric, higher dimensional aspect of who and what we are. And there's some really interesting science to back it up. Do you want to get into the science a little bit?
A little bit. That would be great. I think people like it. You know, it's helps validate some of this.
Okay, some interesting things to throw out there.
Yeah, go ahead. I was just going to say a lot of it sounds very quantum physics, you know, but maybe you're going to go into that a little bit, or
I actually don't lean into quantum stuff very much because it's used so often in the world of spirituality. And like in a certain sense, quantum is interesting in that it basically says like everything that we see as physical is fundamentally a probabilistic field before it actually arises something physical. And if you think about what we see as physical, and then you say, well, how is mind different than what we see as matter? Then you might say, well, mind is something that's not made up. It's actually something that's just a probability. Like you can change your mind at every single moment, let alone versus holding a pen or something and saying, will this pen be there the next moment? Will this pen be there? Of course it is. It's kind of made up. It's not a probability really that it'll continue to be there. I mean, it is, but it isn't. Mind is much more malleable. But let's start with the brain. And one great insight into this comes from cutting edge brain science. So, for example, at the Blue Brain Project, which is a research project over in Switzerland, which is the biggest, most expensive, most extensive brain research that humankind has ever taken on. What they were doing is trying to understand neurotopology, as it's called, like a specialized way of saying, how does the brain map its own communication? Like when a synapse fires, how does it communicate with the other synaptic firings to produce a function? Like if you raise your arm or if you have a certain kind of physically monitored function, what is the correlation in terms of the synaptic firings and how are they communicating? That was their quest. They said, we're going to figure out once and for all the best version of understanding how does the brain communicate with itself, because the brain is very, very complicated. So they fed all this information and data into a supercomputer, and what the supercomputer shot back out and said, this is the only way in which the brain is communicating with itself, and that is through higher dimensional geometry.
Whoa.
Okay.
Okay.
So that the brain, and this is not like, it's not a controversial thing. It's something that they themselves didn't anticipate, but this is the only way in which the topology and the communication of a brain's network is communicating with itself. It's through geometric structures or geometric interfaces that are not limited to three-dimensional shapes of length, width, and height, but that go up into fourth, fifth, sixth, and mostly seventh dimensional objects. Now, we don't exist in a spatial way in dimensions beyond three. Like we can't envision fourth and fifth dimensional objects. It's very hard to imagine a fifth dimensional or sixth dimensional object in your mind's eye, because we don't function within those parameters, right? However, what your brain is doing is it is communicating in these higher dimensions. Now, what does that mean? They don't know what it means as a conclusive thing, but they know that that's what the results are. What it means from the framework that we're talking about today is that your body is interfacing to an electromagnetic field, that your brain is the highest physiological aspect of your body. It's the organizing feature of the body, the integrative function, the governing vessel, that kind of thing, right? It organizes all of the different signals of the body and puts them together. And then there's a cascade effect down in which our physiology is functioning, the different rhythms, the hormones, the glands, everything is kind of following the what do you call it? I'm thinking of like the marching band, the conductor. The nervous system and the brain in particular is the conductor of the rest of the orchestra. And so what they're seeing is that the brain is talking to a communication interface that is not based in physical reality. It's based in higher dimensions. And what are they really talking about? They're talking about the field, that your brain is communicating and interfacing an electromagnetic field that is multi-layered, multi-dimensional, and predominantly functioning up through 7 dimensions. And this just happens to be the dimension or the number that is used to describe the crown chakra, which is the highest chakra, which is the most complex chakra, and which integrates and kind of has all of the rest of the chakras or dimensions integrated up through them. There's no randomness to that.
And in Taoist alchemy, there are also 7 dimensions. So that's, not because of the chakras, but just that's how they describe it as well. 3, we're in the middle one. We're in the 4th dimension, and there's 3 above and 3 below. Interesting. But go ahead.
Yeah. So that's one piece where, for instance, when you say to a person, is my mind my brain? You immediately can start to ask these bigger kind of questions that we're talking about, but a piece of really, really juicy cutting edge science. And I'm talking really, really cutting edge. Like it's about 6 or 7 years old, the study I'm talking about, but it's something that hasn't even begun to be integrated into neuroscience and everything, because they don't actually have a framework to understand what in the world could be going on, other than that it's verifiable. And that's just one major piece to show that your brain is not there's something much more complicated going on with mind. A useful thing for people to think about is the radio analogy. And so it's kind of like your body is the radio, but the radio is just a physical converting device for information that's actually arising or being broadcast from elsewhere. So if you heard a radio announcer saying the weather today is going to be cold and gray and whatever, you wouldn't take the radio, smash it open, and say, "Where's that person talking to me?" That would be ridiculous. And it's the same concept or the same idea when it comes to the mind-body connection, that our minds are actually really the field aspect in relation to the body, and that we're communicating through the body. It interfaces through the body, but it's actually not localized at the body. And this is where the word non-locality comes in. And there's a lot of interesting stuff with that as well.
So tell us a little bit about the non-locality.
The idea is that reality has a level of construction which has a non-local feature, meaning that things are connected outside of time and space, basically, that things aren't limited. There's this idea that in Einsteinian physics, which is currently being ravaged and torn down, which is that the speed of light is the fastest anything can go, and nothing can basically communicate or connect faster than the speed of light. And so there's all things from quantum mechanics like quantum entanglement, which was in Einstein's lifetime, which showed that that's not true at all. You can entangle 2 particles, send them to opposite sides of the universe, and they can communicate with one another at the level of simultaneity, not like sort of faster than light. Literally, it's simultaneity. Like there's something going on in which everything is connected outside of time and space. And so that is a really hot topic in the sciences now. It's a really hot topic in physics. And something that, again, there's no, like, we're not living in that paradigm from modern science. We're catching up to what that paradigm might look like in the next 10 or 20 years, because we haven't yet integrated these kinds of insights. So,
and again, is such evidence that these long distance treatments that I do all the time as well, it's like, how does that, simultaneous, experience happen where I could feel something in my body that person simultaneously feels across the, in Australia or, somewhere really far from me.
Right. It's really straightforward that the yogis used to call this Maya, or illusion, that reality is illusory. And that doesn't mean that it's not real. It just means that it is not absolute. It's not the deepest level of resolution to what's going on. And so, there is this principle called the holographic principle. And the holographic principle says, in all parts, the whole. In every part, the whole, right? And many, many physicists do believe we're in a holographic reality. And that means that if that's true, and I certainly believe that's true, I actually would say that it is empirically true based on my own perception. And that's because of the nature of how it is you can kind of work with information in these fields we're talking about, in that all information is actually everywhere. And holographic reality says in all parts the whole, meaning that in your nail is embedded the information of the whole universe. In every cell is embedded or encrypted the information of the whole universe. And this is about how we're connected, how we're interconnected outside of time and space at a profound and radical level that's really, really different than we think is going on. So the yogis, they say there's the relative and the absolute. And what we're talking about is an absolute level of connectivity in which all of this illusory or superficial layer, which we're seeing in time, in space, which is a carrier for the mind and the body to have an experience, actually has an underlying connective network that transcends those very dualistic parameters. And that really starts to give us insight into how these different things in healing work and all kinds of mysterious phenomena start to be explained through that lens. And there's some very, very convincing cutting edge science, again, that backs this up.
And the math, the Fibonacci sequences and things that keep repeating at various micro, macro levels. Yeah,
absolutely. Fibonacci. I love that stuff. When you get into Fibonacci, you're starting to talk about the golden mean. You're starting to talk about fractals, and fractals is basically the discovery that everything is one thing on repeat. Self-similarity. So that the idea is that the very seed that creates the pattern from the beginning of this universe is literally just a repeat over and over and over again. The same pattern, the exact same pattern is repeating itself over and over again. And things simply look different based on the scale from which you perceive it from. And so there's a word in science called scale invariance, is that there is actually everything's the same. It just looks different at different scales, but the fundamental underlying kind of structures are exactly the same from the very large to the very small. So you can see this for people who want to see how fractals reveal how reality is constructed at this self-similar pattern. All you have to do is look at the most famous thing that Fractals has ever produced, and that is the Mandelbrot set zoom. So you watch these, very hippie-like psychedelic, landscape. You go to any Mandelbrot set zoom, and what it is it's a fractal pattern that is topographically illustrated, meaning it's a mathematical set that's converted into a topography, and it goes infinitely deep. And so you get these zoom sets where you start with a shape, and it looks like a bug, kind of looks like a black beetle is kind of what it looks like. And it really is a cardioid pattern, which is like a circle pulling into itself. And you start with the shape. And what happens is you hit play, and anybody can do this on Zoom, and you start zooming in, and you start with that pattern. And then this crazy, colored landscape opens up, and you're kind of flying through these different shapes and scales and whatever. And then every once in a while, every 5, 10, 30 seconds goes by, and all of a sudden you see the bug again. You go, oh, there's the bug, and then you kind of zoom in, and then you fly through the center of the bug, and then it just turns into this kaleidoscopic pattern again. And you go, what's going on? And then you see the bug again, and you see the bug over and over again. But the thing is this, the whole thing is only the bug. It's actually never not the bug. And that's what the fractal pattern is. This universe is one pattern on repeat. Everything is the one thing. It's just that we perceive it differently, which is, the whole spiritual alchemy, spiritual traditions of waking up, is to realize our connectedness and to realize the profound unity that is. And you have to kind of cut through this identity level stuff that we're talking about earlier, where we perceive ourselves as limited, or we perceive ourselves as only a break through that through our direct experience. It's not a philosophical thing. That's what's really important is, it could sound like I'm just spouting off philosophy or something like that. But when it comes to the science of self-transformation, it's really about this history and this inheritance that we have from so many great traditions and masters, and then people living as well who can attest to the same thing through their own direct experience, their own language, that in fact, things are really different than what they seem to be. But we have to be willing to, if this is exciting for anybody, you have to be willing to do that work yourself, because the intellectual aspect isn't what we're talking about. It's first and foremost a direct knowing or a knowledge. And that's the thing that sets you free. That's the healing. That's the transformation. That's the awakening.
So do you distinguish between the spirit and the mind and the body in that dialogue of what you're just talking about, that transformational process? Like, where does that break down for you, or how would you describe that?
The schema that I use is that there's unity and duality, and all things dualistic fit within the infinite. So finite things fit within the infinite. And the infinite, you could say, is represented by a circle. And that which is finite becomes a kind of infinity symbol within the circle, if you will. So there's a dualistic kind of continuum within the infinite. And so in our direct experience, we would know this as there's my mind, which are the thoughts. There's my body, which are the sensations. And then there is spirit, which is the isness. You could call it awareness or consciousness. But if you can see a thought, right? If you can see a thought and the mind is only comprised of thoughts, thoughts up to and including I am, like I, the seed of the self being I,
Right.
you can actually go like, okay, I am Keith. That's my body, Keith, right? Let's erase Keith. Then you can say, I am. And you can erase the I and say, oh, that's an identity. That's like my mind self-reflects and goes, oh, the mind wants to have a self. It's like a vehicle for the experience of mind. It has to construct a reflection. But then you can erase the I and you can just be am or beingness or isness or amness. And that quality is ever present. It's not something you turn on and off. It's not something that has an identity. It just is. I mean, the language, literally, it's an infinitive. It's infinite. And that's how I work with that language, mind, body, spirit. The spirit is the isness that is ever present.
That's perfect. So I would map that to the Chinese philosophy of the spirit as a big Shen. Shen is the word for spirit, which is the am. And then you come into an existence, an incarnation, and then you get a little Shen, which is the I. And then that splits into 5 spirits. And then there's different aspects of that, which is more that mind, what we call the Yi, which lives in the heart and is representative of purpose and intent and like things that you want to do, your destiny, your curriculum for this lifetime. So that's interesting. That kind of maps to that. And there was something that you said, I wanted to just mention about, you were talking about all that is and everything, the everything coming out of that. And there's some recent research on the heart. And the heart they're finding is in the shape of a helix that is very much similar to a galaxy. The shapes of galaxies are in our heart, and our heart has this kind of helix shape to it. And, one of the things that I was going to ask you today is about the heart in terms of this field energy work more in a healing capacity or maybe in self-healing, and what you think about just the idea of, the field of energy that emanates from the heart itself, or that we like to say there's a void inside the heart in alchemy. And I wanted to see what you think about that.
Yeah, well, the heart is definitely the key to human inner transformation. And that's because we basically human identity, the way we map it, the way field dynamics maps it, human identity is rooted in the third chakra and the consciousness of that which we call the ego, or you were calling the little Shen.
The little Shen.
The little Shen. So your personality is really, really like, if you could think of the chakras as like windows of identity, the third chakra is the window of identity in which you look out and you say, oh, I'm Keith, like this name that's been ascribed to this body. And by default, that's what we're attached to and identified with. And it makes sense. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But to kind of move up beyond that and to go to the next stage or level would be to go 1 up from 3 to 4, and that goes up to the heart. And that means that the heart is where we go from that individuated sense of I to where we actually open ourselves up to the compassion and the unconditional love for other, in which we actually see that we're actually not separate at a first level. And that requires us to start to work with our emotions much more deeply. It requires us to work with our judgments of ourselves and others much more deeply. Forgiveness and compassion are the big words in the Eastern and Western tradition. And those literally open your heart. When you practice forgiveness or you practice compassion, you're like setting off like matches into the heart. It literally creates these explosions in the center of the field when you really practice forgiveness and compassion well, when you need it. And it's a wonder. Talk about alchemy. It's a really, really important place. the 0 point of the heart is really interesting to consider because the geometry of the heart in so many traditions, especially the yogic, is the star tetrahedron, or the Star of David, as it is on the flag of Israel. But it's all over the world, this shape, right? One triangle pointing up, one triangle pointing down in perfect equilibrium. And what that is showing us is that there is perfect equilibrium in the heart center. It's where the forces are equalized in the system, above and below, upwards and downwards. And that's the only place that happens. If you work with a 7 numbering system, then there's 3 above, 3 below, and 1 in the center. And so the heart is the access point to, you might call it the still point or the 0 point. And this is true in the sacred world in terms of how they saw it and understood it. But it's also true in this really interesting emerging field of where sacred geometry is being understood in these more kind of complex geometric mappings of how the 0 point field may arise, whether you look at somebody like Buckminster Fuller's teachings and the vector equilibrium, or you look more contemporary at somebody like Nassim Haramein and his isotropic vector equilibrium, which is like an iteration on from Buckminster Fuller's work. But what they're showing you is that the only geometry that exists that actually has equilibrium inherent in it is the very seed of what we see in the ancient world in that star tetrahedron shape.
All into like something that we can utilize on our own. And so I'm starting to think about, all right, so where do we go from here? Like, how do we begin to engage this philosophy, this idea in ourselves? And maybe not so much as practitioners, but just like in terms of maybe our own heart, our own mind, our obviously emotions are, I keep hearing from you, are key. What would you say would be like some steps that you would take, or beginning things to think about?
Yeah. So, I mean, number one, I'm always a proponent of people following their own kind of desire and passion when it comes to inner work. I think that compass that we have is something that's so important to follow, because anybody, especially for those of us who are have been doing this for a while, and especially if we specialize in certain modalities or ways of practicing, we have like prescriptions, or we have like a particular pathway that people can kind of walk down and stuff, and those can be wonderful. They can fit like a glove, but without like desire, without authentic desire to do inner work, I think it's hard for people to go very deep within themselves, because it really does require real commitment and real, in a certain sense, excitement to like want to really get down and dirty with one's inner self, because you have to be interested in facing your pain. You have to be interested in welcoming in your fear and your discomfort. You have to start to become comfortable in your discomfort. Basically, that's what doing inner work is at some level of resolution. It doesn't mean that it's all negative or bad or heavy, but what it means at some level and at some point, a big emphasis is just going to be about learning to be really okay with not being okay. And that's a skill. Like for me, I started with meditation and yoga, and doing all this yoga asana. What I was doing was I was stretching my body in a way that was very, very uncomfortable. And I learned how to be okay with like high levels of discomfort in my body. And then naturally, kind of like a wax on, wax off kind of way, translated over into me becoming more and more comfortable with being okay with what was uncomfortable in my mind. It was like a training ground for that. So I always suggest that people get into some level of meditation. I don't think that people can get very far without meditation in one form or another. It doesn't have to be a traditional meditation. It doesn't have to look like meditation is supposed to look like, but it needs to be something where one develops present moment awareness. And the classical, sit down, close your eyes, watch the moment with some level of guidance in the sense of, do this or that, or attend to it in a particular way, tends to be the most distilled version of developing presence. So I'm a big fan of suggesting people do that, because
one of the things that I always say too is like, what if you want to develop a self-cultivation practice, what gets you excited to get out of bed in the morning? Maybe if it's morning that you do it and, you jump out of bed like, yay, I get to go do my thing. That's for me. And a lot of times I think that particular meditation maybe doesn't match the person's, nature, and they haven't yet found that thing that's like, yes, I want to do that. So we always invite people to like you say, explore and, don't get bogged down in the one meditation that you think you should be doing, because it might not be that. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like, like I was saying, it's really tough if you don't, in a certain sense, enjoy what you're doing. If you're not excited, like I spent the first 4 years of my practice so excited to wake up and first thing sit and meditate for an hour. It was like I was so excited, even if it meant it was going to be like awful, like, even if it meant I was going to get really bored, or something in me was really excited and curious. I brought a real genuine innocence to that, and that's a sign. And then things have morphed over the years. Things have changed. Different things work for me at different times, and I try and follow that sense of excitement and passion.
I like that word curious. I think that's really instrumental in the beginning of a process, that curiosity of yourself, which again almost says you're watching yourself again, like there's a separation. That curiosity is, kind of an exterior part of you watching the interior part of you, or some separation of like, who am I feeling? I like that. That's a great word.
Yeah. Curiosity, that beginner's mind idea, innocence, openness, flexibility, plasticity, flexibility. So just, being curious about the moment and what's happening. 'Cause like I said, without that, it's very hard for change to take place, deep change. When we talk about holistic healing, it's very hard for it to take place in any kind of sustainable manner if a person doesn't have some enhancement or increasing level of self-awareness. And that self-awareness comes from that present moment ability to witness, as we were describing, because that creates discernment. It creates the ability to go like, oh, this is what is happening right now. This thought is present. These emotions are present. These sensations are present. And without that clarity, what are you doing? It's really, really hard. So that's where we train people. That's how we start with things, is learning to witness, learning to and to pair that witnessing and those kind of core meditation instructions with a location in the body, with a centering in the body through the core of the body. So to land your attention to witness from an anchor point of, your central channel, in a sense, from you could say your spine or your central axis, and also to remain grounded and to learn to be grounded as well. So generally speaking, when we access our center, when we're learning to do that, we have a default way of being kind of behind the eyes, and what we need to do if we want to have more of a full body awareness or a full self-awareness, we need to extend our attention down through the chest, through the heart. And then in particular, what's most challenging for most people is to start to have much more awareness in their belly and into their pelvis. And that's where we become really anchored in the physical, because it's very easy to, a lot of people do not have awareness of their pelvis. They don't have awareness of their belly. And so that process is usually a long and arduous one to really start to get grounded and get embodied.
Yeah, in alchemy, I know you work with this concept too. We have the lower elixir field, or dantian, it's called in Chinese medicine, which is that pelvic below the belly button area. And then we have that middle elixir field, or dantian, which is like chest and heart and upper belly. And then we have the head, which is the upper. And yes, you have to start in the lower dantian to do alchemy as well. You have to even work all the way with the perineum at the base of your torso, the lowest, most yin place of the body. So yeah, that resonates there. I had another thought about fields, just because we're talking about that today. And I was thinking also about, meditation, great, but meditation can be used in this sense as well, of the flexibility of thought, the morphine of the hardened belief system. So like there's a way when I'm working with people, I recognize that there are certain very rigid thoughts, beliefs, things that are maybe non-physical, completely non-physical, like you mentioned a couple, like I'm no good at this, or I'm going to be really bad at this, or like these sort of rigid ways of thinking. And I wanted to know what you might have to say about like working with this idea of fields and this idea that you can kind of drop in, at least in alchemy, what we do is we drop into where things can get more flexible, more maybe open to change, even our thought forms, not just our physical matter. Where, I mean, I know that there's been reported in Tibet, they're the treasure finders who could reach their hands inside cave walls and pull out, like a knife or some treasure revealer function. And how did they do that? Well, they were working with fields. They were basically, in some of the Chinese immortals were reported to walk through walls. How did they do that? How did they basically deform into particles and then walk through a wall and reform again? They were supposed to have also done that in time and space, moving through different times and different places. So anyway, I'm going out there, but I was thinking more like for someone just trying to embrace some of this, like the meditation is, yes, we all need to kind of start to begin to self-cultivate with that. But the concept of these thoughts or things, and that that we, if we really admit it, have some rigidity in some of our thoughts. How do we begin to use this field, what you call field dynamics, for example, to begin to, soften those rigid things in our minds?
That's a really good question. So I think it'd be useful to just like paint a picture of like what we're all sitting with in one way or another. So let's say I grow up and I have an older sibling and I'm 3 years old, 2 years old, and the older sibling is really good at everything. And my parents take a liking to the older sibling in that, oh, Johnny is so excellent, at school, at sports, at whatever. And so even as a very young child, whether I even can even understand the language entirely, there's an energy, there's information coming my way that says like, you're not as good as Johnny, you're less than, right? Mm-hmm. So what that creates is a sense potentially of a lack of self-confidence, that might create a sense of anger and resentment towards the older brother, jealousy. It might create a sense of sadness. It could be that there's anxiety about performing or being as good as there's all these different ways in which that message, whether, intentional or malicious or not from the parents, and we're not getting into that aspect of things, is nonetheless supporting this idea where the very young child takes on the belief of I'm not good enough. I'm not good enough. Right now, that's a thought form we've established. That's actually a form in the field, and it would map onto the body in a particular way. So think of it as like a bubble growing out of your brain or any area of your body, and the bubble kind of blooms out and it interfaces the body at various points. And some of these various points will intersect chakras. Some of them will intersect meridian points. Some of them ultimately will be touching into what in the long line of succession winds up being like physical organs or aspects of hormones or glands or whatever, parts of the body. Okay, so there's that thought, right? And that thought is connected even then to some of the emotions that we said, like maybe anxiety, et cetera, et cetera. So it happens at a young age, and then iteration after iteration, iteration after iteration, right? That same thought form gets stimulated in the being. So it might be that happens once a year. It might be that happens once a week as you're growing up. And that form gets stronger. It keeps being thought. And what might be at some level conscious in some people, at some point likely starts to become subconscious. So it actually becomes like a filter through which your experience just automatically passes through that belief about oneself. And the emotions are activated each time, the thought is activated each time, and the way in which it interfaces the body gets activated each time. That person grows up, they get into their 20s or their 30s. That same issue keeps working out in their relationships and their professional life and all these different things, right? And at a certain point, they start to have dysfunction in their pancreas. And they don't know why their pancreas isn't working well. The blood tests are showing this, or they have this, that, and the other, right? And they're wondering, oh, I have this pancreatic thing that's going on, right? Little do they know, and this is obviously hypothetical, but little do they know that the root cause of the pancreatic dysfunction is actually the belief that they're not good enough. Yeah. Because what's happened is that at the field level, at the electromagnetic level, that thought form has rigidified to the point in which you could say it's crystallized in the field. It has become rigid. It's become a groove, just like your arm. You can have repetitive stress, issues. Yeah. Your mind, every time you think something, can create a groove. It can create a certain kind of pattern, a habit pattern that gets very habituated.
We call it a hook. We call it a hook, and talk about the ghost points. Yeah, that's what the ghost points are for. Yeah,
exactly. And then it has the associated emotion. And then what's going on is that the field and the body are trying to communicate. They're trying to have a flow between this electromagnetic domain of chi, of prana, through to the physical. And the function of health is determined by the kind of the robust nature of the communication between the energy and the material, the body and the mind, the openness of those things. And that creates what we call health and vitality in general. So if we want to go in and change that, we need to find a lever or a mechanism that enables us to pull up that information and to face it in a skillful way. So you could take acupuncture points and put them along the pancreas, the spleen pancreas channel, or the related channels maybe that the practitioner finds. And what that does is it unlocks from the physical level the underlying energetic architecture through the different dimensions that start to allow the body to open up, the emotions to open up, the thoughts and the beliefs to open up, and potentially to open up that channel and the associated blockage at an energetic level and emotional level. You could work with an energy healer, and you work with the techniques of energy healing in which different kinds of frequencies and different processes are brought directly into the field by non-physical means, which augment the field electromagnetically and then make their way down through the physical body. So you have like going from an energetic to a physical indirectly versus a physical to an energetic indirectly in the acupuncture model of at least using physical needles, right? So if people are interested in working through things, it's just a matter of having a mapping system, having a diagnostic system and a technique in which you're able to identify something and then bring some attention to it and focus and get that stuck energy to move in one way or another. It doesn't matter the technique. You could be doing breath work as well. You could be doing all kinds of stuff out there,
Yeah, there's so many different ways. I realized that long ago when I was trying to figure out what I believed, and I realized, oh my gosh, it really depends on the person, what they need to do for themselves. I liked that you said that. Wow, this is fantastic. This is just what I wanted to talk about today. So thank you. This is really great. And I think we might want to just hear a little bit about you, Keith, and what you're doing, for listeners, if they're interested in learning more about your work, where would they go for that? And, is there anything else you want to share with them today before we finish?
Sure. So if people want to find what work I'm doing with field dynamics, you mentioned the website at the beginning. It's energyfielddynamics.com. We specialize in energy healing. So there's a kinship with people practicing all subtle energy arts, such as yourself, because we are working energetically or informed truly holistically in one way or another. Different ways in, but same central theme. And we specialize in training people in energy work. We do one-on-one sessions with people as well, Christabel and myself. But the main thing is we created Field Dynamics 5 years ago now to provide a training format that is much more comprehensive and professional and robust than what we were seeing out there, and to, in a certain sense, exemplify the potentials of energy healing as we weren't seeing out there in a lot of short form trainings or very ungrounded kinds of trainings in the language they were using. So we bring scientific language, we bring very grounded concepts, and we have a coursework that creates like a long-term structure for people to go through the transformational process with a lot of support in a kind of a community environment. And I have a book coming out.
Wonderful.
I have my first book coming out soon, which I'm really excited about, and putting it into publishing very shortly. So that's another thing. But yeah, we have tons of resources on our site and the podcast, as you mentioned, and what we're doing. Everything can be found on our website.
And I should say, for anyone who's known your podcast in the past, it used to be called Field Dynamics before you and it's recently been renamed to, tell me again.
The Future of Wellness.
The Future of Wellness. So
yes,
it's a wonderful podcast with a lot of great interviews. And so you guys can all check him out there. And so I just want to thank you. I found this conversation just perfect. I mean, it's really wonderful to think about the idea that we can, change some of these, rigid things in our consciousness. And I loved all the scientific stuff that you brought in. And I will recommend that Keith has a lot of stuff on their website that is explaining some of these scientific concepts. So that's really helpful. And again, I really appreciate you sharing all of this with us today. That's awesome. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really a pleasure to be on the show. Good to connect with you again. And
Great.
So much.
Thank you. Bye.
You've been listening to the Inspired Action Podcast, and you've reached the end. Woohoo! Why not celebrate a little bit and click that subscribe button right there. We love having you with us on this journey, and we want it to continue.
You can also rate and review this podcast. And if you have already, thank you so much. We read all reviews, and your reviews help other people find this podcast as well. You can also be a part of this podcast yourself by submitting a voice recording message and emailing it to us at lita@inspiredactionpodcast.com or jay@inspiredactionpodcast.com.
And if you want, you can join our Facebook group or follow us on Instagram.
Join us next week for another Inspired Action conversation. And thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening, and remember to hug the dog.